To me, instinct is God, really. I mean, that somehow instinct and accident are sort of probably the two most important things I would say. You have to follow that through. In 9 times out of 10, it doesn't work. But the idea of something happening or it going wrong, I know, for instance, a painting has to go wrong on the whole before it then finds its way again. Hello, I'm Anne Rothenstein and I'm a painter. Normally, I would wake up, as my studio's at home, come up here with a cup of tea, see what I'm doing, think about everything, not do anything, then go for a walk, then do all my chores. Get everything out of the way so I don't have to think about anything else. I don't have to kind of get into a kind of zone particularly, but I need to know I'd have nothing else to do. Once I've started, it will be one of a sort of complete sort of mini adventure. Well, let's take my separation, which was a huge turning point in my work in a funny sort of way. I didn't know it was going to be, but I was painting a figure and I wiped out, this is how often things happen, I wiped out some paint, and it was white paint, and it went across the face of the figure that I was painting. And in my head, it instantly turned into a bride's veil. And I realized I started doing these bride paintings, which I did 2 or 3 of. And then afterwards, I realized it was while my divorce was coming through. And indeed, that Remains of the Wedding Breakfast, which is in the Charleston show. So that came out of, I really liked the objects that were on this bride's bench. So one painting will always lead to another. There was a flower and a cigarette packet peeping out of a black case and some other things. And so in a way, I started that still life simply from saying, oh, I like those objects. I'd like to do a still life of those objects. You know, there's a packet of cocaine, there's a straw. You know, it is quite a dark, you know, a faded cocktail cake with a cigarette being stubbed out in it. In other words, it's a very, both a bleak painting, but it's a still life. But I mean, that was not, I didn't consciously mean to do that. That's what keeps me interested in painting. I'm waiting to see what appears in a way. I also have no training, so this business of working from instinct is where it all comes from. I have a commitment to a painting. When I start a painting, it is completely involving in a way that collage, I can take, leave, play around a bit. I don't know, it's much more arbitrary in a way, collage. I love making collage, and I find it quite hard making decisions. I almost get nervous before I start a painting. You know, you kind of, there's a kind of weird, it's a real relationship that goes on between me and a painting and paint that's very, it's both intense, but it's also, I'm not that serious. I don't mean I'm not serious about it. Of course I'm serious about it, but I'm not that sort of precious about it. I've never not been able to love the grain of wood when I'm using it. Often I don't often know, it gets lost and disappears and I forget about the grain of the wood. But on the whole, I love wood. I like the smell of the wood, I like the feel of the wood. It has no texture, it might have a grain, but it's a completely flat surface. So, you know, you go to canvas and it's got all these bumps, you know, it's got a texture, but it's not as interesting to me as wood. And I'm not very keen on the give of canvas. I like, you know, I like to be able to get angry with the thing. I scrape off a lot of paint. I treat it roughly, and wood is perfectly happy for me to do that. I came from this family of artists, but I didn't have, nobody ever sort of talked about art. I mean, no, art was, as I think I've said, it was just like food and water. It wasn't, I never went, for instance, my parents never took me to a museum or an art gallery. It wasn't that thing, but it was very extraordinary, and it's what I thought was completely and utterly normal. And I've always carried on thinking it's the way to live. finishing a show, which is a kind of very bewildering time, because after all, you've spent your entire, however long it's taken, from one painting leading to another, and suddenly that chain is broken and you have to start all over again. So in a way, to play now is what I want to do, and muck around and not feel I'm doing something that is going to be shown. And that's a kind of a treat, because you don't, you want to go back to being very private, messing up, things all going wrong, and it not mattering.